afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with a little bit of a contest. How many of you have more than 100 unread emails in your inbox? Does anyone have more than 1,000? More than 10,000. How many unread text messages do you have? 0. I've done this a few times, and the answer is always the same. At the National Academies, I think the winner had 13,632 unread emails in her inbox and 0 unread text messages. So it suggests when we want to reach someone like you, to engage you in an intervention or a clinical trial, to keep you engaged, that perhaps email isn't the best strategy. We should text you. Unfortunately, sometimes we have a tendency to find something that works and want to use it over and over and over again. What my husband likes to remind me is that when he doesn't answer my first text message, it's called nagging when I keep texting him over and over again, not nudging. What I like to think of that is because it's important to remember that there's a lot of different strategies that we can use from behavioral science to get people engaged and to keep people engaged. And our job is to figure out which ones to use and which ones work best in different settings. The other thing that's important for me to remember as a behavioral scientist in healthcare is that most people, patients in particular, would rather hang out with Steve the Sloth than me in my health intervention. I'd rather be on Steve the Sloth's Instagram feed, I have to be honest. He's quite charming. And I think it's an important thing to remember because people want to do things that are enjoyable. They like to be delighted, and a lot of what we do in healthcare is quite the opposite of delight and enjoyment. A lot of our interventions, our documents, our programs look like they were written in Word 95, and they don't really reflect the consumer experience that people are used to having today. So I'm going to talk about the 4 things that we do when we want to personalize something in behavioral science and the strategies that we lean on. So there are 4 core elements to personalization: content, context, composition, and channel. We talked about channel, and we talked about using text versus email. And part of that is, how do we get your attention? So there's a lot of behavioral change strategies that we can deploy, and we'll talk about that, but it doesn't matter what's in my app or my platform if you never open it. So the channel that I want to connect with you is an important one. The composition plays into things like surprise and delight. Does it look good? It's why we want to use designers and people who understand the user experience in our programs and platforms. Most of the personalization science is around content, and I think we're starting to have more conversations around context, which is great. So I started a digital weight management company. It came out of a clinical trial in my co-founder's lab, and we would text people every day in response to their use of a connected scale. And the way that we used context in the personalization was to take something like our couple here, Jane and Steve, not Steve the Sloth, clearly. They're married, they live in the same house, so their neighborhood is the same, their food environment in the household is the same. To Jane's chagrin, they weigh the same thing. But they have different behavioral motivators that play into what might make them want to engage in different weight loss behaviors. And so when we think about the context, I'd certainly want to play into those behavioral motivators, but I also want to consider how the context can amplify or negate those things. So as an example, Jane, who likes to exercise, and when she exercises, likes to exercise outside, is going to respond differently when the forecast calls for rain than Steve, who doesn't like to exercise and never exercises outside. So what we would do is to take that weather data and send Jane a message that says, hey, the forecast looks bad, make a plan accordingly, or on a gorgeous day like today, right, you have an opportunity to get outside and make sure you've got a plan to do that. So we can use context to amplify the behavioral strategies that we want to use, the motivators, the barriers that people might have, but we can also use them to surprise and delight people. When you get a message that talks about the weather in your area, that's something people don't expect from a health app. And when we did this, it was 2014, and a lot hasn't changed, right? We still have a pretty generic experience in a lot of our health apps. So this can also make people more engaged with our application. So there's 2 levels of engagement that we're trying to get into. Engage you with our platform, and then engage you in the desired behavior. Content is where most people think of personalization coming into play. It's getting a lot of press these days, but personalization and the spectrum of things we can do to personalize has actually been around for a long time. Direct mail folks nailed this. Everyone remember the Publishers Clearinghouse came in the mail, and it was like, Kate, you're gonna win $1 million. Or rather, my mother was gonna win $1 million because, it was a little bit ago. But when I started out in the health promotion field in the 90s, we would put a physician's photo in the letter we were mailing to people to connect with them, to make them more likely to pay attention to what was in our letter because they thought it was coming from their physician. It didn't quite feel so generic. We've also been doing this for a while with mailings that are timed to someone's birthday. Say 45, you might get a letter from your health system or health plan reminding you that you're now eligible to get a colonoscopy because everyone's just clamoring to get a colonoscopy. But we now can do a lot more personalization and lean into this in new ways because we can actually get data more rapidly and respond more rapidly to people with technology. And that allows us to use the content to actually tap into what someone is doing and personalize our response back to them in the messaging. It allows us to personalize the behaviors and barriers that we're addressing. And so the other thing that's really interesting to me about the personalization science, particularly in the hype cycle that we can sometimes get in when it comes to strategies these days, is that perceived personalization may be as effective as actual personalization. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, Kate's saying you have to go out and spend $10 million on an AI ML engine to personalize my entire experience, I'm not saying that at all. You can actually use a pretty basic concept that we use in a lot of our behavior change strategies to get to personalization and figure out how to deploy it. And essentially, that's what we call TNT. You pick your behavior change theory, you identify the needed behavior, and you pick your behavior change technique. And those things come together, and you have an effective way to engage in personalization and the personalization of your behavioral strategy into your intervention. So the theory of behavior change, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to tell you that one is better than the other. The most important thing is that you have one. So this is self-determination theory. A lot of times when people bring me in, they're asking me to look at how do we motivate people and how do we keep them motivated. And the behavior change theory that self-determination theory puts forward is that people have 3 key drivers of their motivation. They want to be autonomous. We don't like to be told what to do. Anyone who has a teenager can tell you that that is the truth. Competent. We like to feel like what we are doing is working and that we are going to be successful in what we do. And relatedness. We want to feel connected to other people and the world around us. So it's an example of how thinking about a behavior change strategy can inform what you might do or say in your program or intervention. Then we get to the needed behavior. Now, lots of things can be behaviors that we want to act on, and particularly when you're working in chronic diseases like I am, we're not just doing something one time, although that could be a needed behavior. I need you one time to sign up for a health plan. I need you one time this year to get a flu shot. If everyone hasn't gotten their flu shot, this is your reminder to do so. It's a nudge, not a nag. I might want you to do something more than once for a period of time, like taking a course of antibiotics. That's the needed behavior I need you to engage in. Or I might want you to do something from now on, like exercise. I want you to go out and do that. For some folks, that might be a new behavior. It might be a behavior we want you to stop, like in a smoking cessation program. We might want you to do more of something. You tell me you're exercising once a week. I'd like you to do that 5 times a week. So we can kind of think about what is the needed behavior that we want the entire population to engage in, and what does that look like for different folks in the population? Is this new, or is this something we're going to enhance or detract depending on the behavior we want to change? The last part of this is the behavior change techniques. Now, most people have heard of a few behavior change techniques. We talked about nudges. Incentives are one that comes up a lot. People love to talk about that with me. We call that in the behavioral science word a reward. The reality is there are close to 100 different behavior change techniques that you can use. That means, for me, there's lots of opportunity and lots of things I could do. It doesn't mean you have to use all of them. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, there's 100 things, this is going to get out of control. It's not. It's thinking about what is the behavior and who is the person and how do we want to bring those things together. So that's kind of the goal when we do a personalization strategy, is to think about how do we take that theory, identify our needed behaviors, and then using the theory and the needed behaviors, pick the behavior change techniques that's likely to lead to the desired outcome. I think it can be quite explosive when you do that. I can't promise that you're going to win a prize. Alfred Nobel, for anyone who doesn't recognize him. But that is generally how we think about bringing behavioral science into the personalization strategies that we want to use to engage people and keep them engaged in our programs. So thank you.